Hi, my name is Ashlyn, and this is my group's presentation on prejudice. I'm going to start by conducting a quick test on the viewer. In a moment, a photo will flash on the screen, and you will be asked a question based off what you may or may not have seen. And don't pause the video in the meantime. 3, 2, 1. What did you see? Did the man look like he was holding a gun or a phone? All right, and I'm about to flash another image. In 3, 2, 1. Now, what did you see this time? Did the man look like he was holding a gun or a phone? All right. And we will come back to this later, but for now, let's talk about what exactly prejudice is. Prejudice is defined as a preconceived negative judgment of a group and its individual members. Prejudice can come in many forms and is often supported by one's own held stereotypes and discriminations. It is just as important to understand what prejudice is not. Prejudice is not discrimination, which is unjustified negative behavior towards a group or its members. Although prejudice can be influenced by discrimination, prejudice is still separate as it is a negative attitude while discrimination is a negative behavior. Prejudice also works as a dual attitude system. There are two types of prejudice, implicit and explicit. Implicit prejudice is the unconscious, intuitive attitude against a specific group of people. Explicit prejudice is the conscious and controlled attitude against a specific group of people. Now, remember the photos I showed at the beginning of the presentation. The idea was to test your implicit bias. So, in the first image, it was a white man holding a gun, while the second image was a black man holding a phone. Now, you might have guessed this right away as you were able to see, but it has been found that often when others take the same test, people more often associate the gun with the black man and the phone with the white man, even when this is not true. And they are also both dressed in formal suits and have typically normal facial expressions. Both types of prejudice are usually learned at a young age, but we are more likely to have changing explicit attitudes. Implicit attitudes are implicit, meaning you aren't so aware of their existence and therefore harder to eliminate. These can include traffic stops or employee discrimination. Prejudice can be learned through school, friends, community, but probably most influential is parents. The prejudicial cycle is a hard one to break because it perpetuates itself. In a way, it is self fulfilling and it takes in depth self education and reflection to undo. There can be positive stereotypes, however, they can still be harmful in creating stereotypes that put pressure on people to excel at something that they aren't particularly good at. This is seen with the stereotype that, in quotes, all Asians are good at math, or that, in quotes, all black people excel at sports. Both are results of prejudiced thinking and deeply rooted racism. So, although the stereotype may seem positive, it can have harmful effects. Now, I will play a quick segment of an example of these biases playing out in the real world.
Implicit bias is a prejudice that turns into an action that is unconscious. You don't know that you are doing it, okay? And explicit bias is a conscious bias. It means that you know exactly what it is that you are doing, and that usually shows up when human beings are afraid. For example, in the module, they walked up to a young woman on the street and they said, "Tell us about a time when you've experienced implicit bias at work." And she said, "Well, I work in a warehouse, and I had a manager who would never subscribe me any hard work. And when I went up to him and asked him, 'Why don't you give me the same amount of work?' he said, 'Because I don't believe that women can lift heavy boxes.'" And she said that was his implicit bias. No, that is explicit. He knew for a fact that he didn't believe that women could lift boxes, therefore he prevented her from lifting boxes. Now, if she had went to him and he involuntarily said that he didn't realize he had done that, then it would have been unconscious. And there's a difference because an implicit bias can transfer to an explicit bias, but an explicit bias cannot transfer to an implicit bias. Let me give you an example of that. So we was working with the company, we did a pay equity analysis. What that means is we looked at gender, for example, to see if there was any difference between the way that men, women, and non-gender binary populations were paid within a company. What we found is that women were paid less for doing the same amount of work and having the same amount of experience. The director of HR was a woman. Most of the hiring managers and recruiters were women in that company. When we pointed out the pay equity analysis, they had no idea that they had been offering women lower salaries. And they fixed it. They went back and gave them equitable salaries. They had to change it. But we changed that bias from being implicit to now saying that it is explicit because you are conscious that you are doing it.
Alright, now, what are in-groups and out-groups? In-groups are known as us, a group of people who share a sense of belonging, a feeling of common identity. Out-groups are known as them, a group of people perceived as distinctively different from or apart from their in-group. Just thinking about these definitions might have made certain people pop into your own minds. Who's your us and them? These groups can be both perceived through explicit and implicit attitudes as well. An in group bias would mean you are favoring one's own group. An out group bias would mean you are disfavoring someone due to them not being in your in group. How does in group bias influence prejudice and discrimination? When you are favoring those considered in your own in group, you are showing prejudice to those not considered in the in group. Once these internal attitudes escalate into influenced behaviors, it turns into discrimination. An example of this would be denying someone a job simply because you are favoring another person, even if the person that you are denying had a neater resume and provided to be a better candidate. This also influences the social dominance orientation, which is a motivation to have one's group dominate other social groups. Self-perpetuating prejudgments is the concept of when you expect someone to act a certain way, our beliefs and actions will then influence their beliefs and actions. There are many forms of prejudice, starting with racial prejudice. Also, in connection to the test at the beginning of this presentation, an example of racial prejudice is when taking the IAT test, people tend to associate with white people more than black people. LGBTQ prejudice also exists in our society. Although the United States has taken some steps in eliminating systematic prejudice, such as with discrimination laws and marriage laws, it still very much exists in communities as well as in the rest of the world. Just as with any other form of prejudice, stereotypes are easily formed in a way to influence other people's beliefs. LGBTQ prejudice are often stronger in those with them when compared to race prejudices since it is more acceptable since, quote, orientation is a choice, when this is in fact not true. The last form of prejudice we will discuss is gender prejudice. Gender prejudice tends to affect women more, but there is also prejudice that impacts men as well. Like previously stated, good stereotypes don't mean that they are okay. Examples of female prejudice would be the notion that women belong in homes and men are supposed to be outside and strong fighters. Socialization is the idea of how prejudice arises in individuals, usually stemming from family. Typically used for creating outgroups, people tend to categorize people into these groups based on certain characteristics such as race, age, or gender. Sometimes one can fulfill the group serving bias, which is when you explain away an outgroup's members' positive behavior or attribute negative behavior only towards an outgroup in order to fulfill the meaning of your categorization. Subgrouping can also occur by forming new stereotypes about a certain group. An example would be seeing an elder. Seeing an elder can lead to the assumption that they're incapable because of their age. Although there is no easy way to fix stereotyping and individual prejudice, it is important to recognize and be aware of these concepts to better understand. And these are our references and citations used throughout this presentation. Thank you so much for listening.